don't know. That's all I'll say. Right, enough about us. We found out a bit about you, but what we're here to talk about is Belbin and culture. Now this, Tom, is a vast subject.
Humongous.
Where do you want to start?
Well, I think people often start with the question of asking about country culture and team roles and ethnic culture and cultural background. But we do also want to touch on the subject of organisational culture, and they overlap. So actually there's an overlap between the two, and a lot of the data that we can talk about overlaps. So hopefully we'll have something interesting to say on both of those topics.
Fantastic. So not just about the country and ethnicity and stuff, but also about organisational culture.
Organisational culture, yeah.
So we're going to try and cover both.
We're going to try within an hour with two fairly talkative people. That's going to be interesting.
So which one should we start with?
Should we start with the country?
Let's start with country. So Tom, over to you. Describe, what do you mean by country culture? I mean,
I mean, we've got huge numbers of people from different countries on the chat here. So that's really what I'm talking about. Your own cultural background, ethnic background. Does that impact on team roles? Might be a question we'll come to. How do you describe those kind of cultural differences? So we could start with that, perhaps.
No, let's go for that. And I've got a whole list of things. I said before, we just had such a chat with lots of do you remember whens? And you were telling me about an example, actually, when you worked in a hospital somewhere. Was it in India? Or?
Yeah, in fact, some people on the chat from India. So the first time I used team roles overseas in my own capacity, I think it's when you actually joined, as I decided I was off for a few months. They were very generous with me. I had an invitation to work and help in the management side of a hospital in northern India, and I did that. And I actually, after a while, I realised that team roles were going to be extremely useful because of the number of the issues they were having amongst the team, the medical team, the director at the time wanted to build a better balanced team. And so we introduced team roles, and wow, did it go down well, including with observer data. So we used self-perception, that's your view of yourself. We used the observer data, and we got some excellent results in terms of enjoyment of the workshops, but also in terms of performance and individuals. So that's the first time I realized, wow, this is really good as a cross-cultural tool.
So it's something you knew worked very much in the UK, on workshops you've been in, but did it work? Was it as relevant?
Was it useful in
worldwide?
Another country, in another country context? And indeed it is.
Oh, wonderful. So how would you describe culture? I mean, I suppose that's where we should start really, isn't it? How would you define it? Because Tom's actually also accredited, well, many tools, aren't you? But didn't you spend some time with von Strompenaars?
I did, yes. Yeah. And they partnered up with Belbin certainly a while ago. Are we able to show some slides?
We can show some slides.
So there's well, why don't we look at Strompenaars?
Okay, let's look at that. Okay, so let's go. Oh. Dun, dun, dun. Everything's just always a bit slow, isn't it?
Okay, so this is an adapted slide. You'll recognise this slide if you've used team roles in workshops. It's basically adapted to add in the idea that part of that context alongside that floating jellyfish is the cultural context. So obviously you've got DNA is what you're born with.
Yeah.
By adulthood, you pretty much develop your personality. That would be the MBTI side of things.
Yeah. The who I am.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So the introversion, extroversion, and the behaviour, which is Belbin, is the so what. So the so what is basically, what do I do with this? What do I do with what I'm born with, my personality? And that can change over time according to cultural context. So that's what we see with that idea of cultural context there. And that also changes according to learning experience, the job change. But the cultural context here might be not only your country of origin, it might be your host culture.
Okay. Yeah.
It might be your organizational culture. So actually these are factors that lead to change in team roles and behavior over time. And that's why it's so interesting to be discussing this topic today.
No, actually, I like this slide. I think this is sometimes it's the simplistic slides and visuals that get the message across, isn't it? Is that the C is the culture.
Yeah.
The C is there, and of course the C may change because where you are, different currents, different flows, etc. That may change. But what we need to do is we need to find out what that culture is, where you are in that C, don't we? To be able to make sense, perhaps, of your team roles and everything else as well.
That's right.
Perfect. So should we go on to the next one?
So this is the Trompenaars definition.
Here we go.
It's, I like this one because it talks, there's Hofstede and others who talk about culture, but I like this definition. So it's the shared ways that groups of people understand and interpret the world. So individuals and groups interpret the world. Shared systems of meanings. And you can see that would apply both to country, culture, ethnic background, but it also applies to organizational culture. And that influences what we pay attention to, how we act, and what we value. And so it really influences behavior. And I think, you know, the obvious way in which Belbin overlaps with culture is those that talk about culture, talk about what you see or you do, and how we do things around here, for example. And that obviously overlaps with that previous slide talking about behavior. So obviously we have something to say on culture and ways, useful ways of describing culture and discussing differences.
You can't really have behaviour and culture, you can't really look at them as separate entities, can you?
Not really, no. And actually culture, I asked Meredith for a one-liner, Meredith Belbin, who still comes into the office.
He was in this morning when Tom came in, yes.
And I asked him, what's your one-liner? And he basically says, well, you can't, it's very difficult to see a culture when you go into an organisation, for example, but you can feel it. So it's something you often pick up intuitively. So there are visual cues of things you might see, but a culture is very much not what's written on the board, you know, as those, we are a team-oriented organization, and they have the picture of the rowing team. You remember that one?
Oh God, yes.
I like ones that take the mickey of that particular slide. I don't know if you see one of those, but it's actually less that, but more how people are interacting, what you're noticing, and it's almost you pick it up intuitively. But the nice thing about Belbin in terms of culture is, as we'll get onto later, we can provide some harder data to help with the describing of what we've already maybe noticed in a culture, both at a country level perhaps, but also at an organizational level.
No, I think absolutely. I'm just checking some of the questions here. Okay. Please put your questions in. What I'm going to try and do is make sure I ask them at the right time, if that's okay. I'll just close that down again now, but we will definitely answer those ones that are coming in. Your behaviour does alter depending on the culture in which you find yourself, doesn't it? And how much you want to fit in, how much you want to succeed within that culture can affect the way that we behave.
That's right. So definitely culture, your cultural background, your ethnic background has an impact on your behaviour. It has therefore an impact on actually your team roles. The question is how far we go with that. We can discuss some of the differences between cultures if you want.
We can do that. Let's look at that next slide actually, because I think that's quite an interesting one, isn't it? So
again, on Trompenaars.
Yeah. So let's just go on to this next slide here. Dun, dun. Dun, dun. There we go.
There we go. So,
there we go.
I mean, those that describe differences between cultures, and I know a number of you use cross-cultural tools, there are different descriptors, different dichotomies, different differences, ways of describing them. But one particular one we might start with is a universalist versus particularist. And this is, Trompenaars uses this, is there one good way that must be followed, or does friendship have special obligations and hence they might come first?
That's an interesting one.
So that has a big impact obviously on the way people view contracts and a number of things. So and a number of others you can see down that list. You've got power distance is an interesting one, you know, the attitudes to hierarchy.
Oh, okay.
So that's a big difference that you might find between cultures.
I quite like this individualism versus collectivism.
That's very interesting.
I love that one because I think that's sometimes quite obvious when you're working
with
organisations.
And Belbin tend to do quite well, surprise, surprise, in collectivist cultures.
Yeah, it's surprising that, isn't it?
It is surprising.
Absolutely. Okay, so you've got these cultural differences here. But how do they sort of manifest themselves?
So how would you see?
How would you? Yeah. How would you see? At some of those in?
Well, I mean, since we're on the slides, we might go to the next one because here I've got some insights into.
Oh, so that was that first one.
That first one we talked about rules or the universalist versus relationships, particularist. Different ways of describing that, but you can see here some hugely varying approaches to such things as contracts. If you look at that second line. So although, as it says for their focus is more on rules and relationships, and the focus in the particular sort of relationship-oriented culture is more on relationships rather than rules. Now, you very much see this when you enter a cultural context. It's basically, yes, that ticket might be, say that you're on this train, but actually the seat was given to a more important person. Okay. And that's relationship. Okay. Or actually, you know, in terms of approaches to contracts, approaches to what some people might say, well, you can't do that, it's not in the rules. And others are saying, well, we've adapted because it's needed and relationally. And you often see that. And it's and even the view of trust I find very interesting, because we can get quite European oriented views on trust. Okay, that's not trustworthy. Well, actually, is it trustworthy to let someone down relationally on the basis of a contract? So that would be that third column, and I found that very interesting to deal with. One of the questions I saw already came in. I'm not supposed to look at the chat, but was, have we used this in Africa? Well, I've used this in Mozambique, actually. And there the issue would very much be one of relationship being of paramount importance. And the trust is, have I built a trusting relationship with you, as opposed to, okay, we've got this contract and therefore we will. Yeah. So these are some of the fascinating differences. Just one, this is just one dichotomy. These are some of the differences that you'd find within that one dichotomy between rules and relationships. A deal is a deal versus relationships evolve.
How does this vary though? You know, does this vary a lot when you've been working? So your experiences here, what we're after, do you see big differences in rules and relationships depending on the cultures in which you're working?
Indeed. And actually, the interesting thing is where you start to mix, you're working in a Western organization, in a host country in the South or in other places. And there you see such an interesting mix. You've got three things going on. You've got my own culture, where I come from. You've got the host culture in the country I'm working in, and then you might have the organization with an offshoot in that country, and you've got three things going on there. Plus then fourth thing is you've got people from other countries working in that organization. So there's a whole mixture. I think the important thing is to realize that actually one way is not best. Okay. And actually to realize that, you know, as part of this diversity, that's why diversity is so important, because you need a variety of approaches. Just because something's in the contract doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do in that context. And just because something could be adapted to according to the relationships doesn't mean that the contract doesn't apply. And actually we need to learn from each other in terms of culture, I think. Okay.
So it's not making assumptions, it's about communicating, it's about the conversations that you can bring up when you're working with these teams to make sure that there is some commonality in understanding.
That's right. And I remember Trump and I was talking about, you know, what are the most important things when a company is setting up overseas is they need to understand the culture in which they're going into, how they view a number of these different things, and it will improve their performance and effectiveness. So it's crucial to understand this stuff. And there's not one lens through. I like the word lenses because that applies to a number of different models. But you know, these models are a great lens through which to look at the world and ourselves within the world, and ourselves within teams within the world.
Yeah. Oh, crikey. I can sense this could be a long one. I'm going to have to play my shaper role to make sure that we stay on track here. Okay, so Jill here's asked, so what do we do to help people recognise these cultural differences? How do we help them really to be able to get those blockages to one side?
Well, I think there's two things. One is basically what we at Belbin can do. Yes. So we at Belbin, we're obviously getting onto that in a little bit, is okay, so the so what? Okay, you've got these cultural differences. The question is still, you've got a multicultural team, perhaps. Yes. The so what? How do we work with that team? And that's really where Belbin comes into its own. Okay. But I would also, you know, I've just mentioned Trump and us a few times, so I hope they give me a bit of a bonus. But, you know, companies like that do profiling. There are a number of companies out there. I know a number of people in the chat who do use cultural profiling tools. I think it's a very useful thing to do, to understand host cultures, to understand cultural differences within teams. But you are always still left with the so what. I mean, why did Trump and us want to work with Belbin? And the reason they wanted to work with Belbin is, okay, I've got this team, so what? What does it actually mean in terms of individuals and what they contribute to the team?
Perfect. Can you talk us through, I'm looking down because we've got copious notes. I've tried to make sure you can't see it on the video. But this next work that you did with this particular team, I think links in quite nicely here. Can you show that? Can you talk us through, Tom?
Okay, so
be really useful.
Okay, back to a slide.
Yeah.
So this basically shows an organisation. We're looking particularly here at 3 cultures, but this was a manufacturing organisation, European based, with a huge manufacturing base in China as well. And here you basically have G for very basic. What people did in this workshop is basically had to put themselves on this dichotomy between more of the facts completion oriented, slightly different wording they were using in this company. So we stuck with the wording they were using in terms of their cultural tools. So they were using the facts oriented, completion oriented versus that people oriented, relationships oriented culture that we were looking at here. And isn't this fascinating?
I love it.
And so we've got a number of slides here that go, so you find we found people of Chinese origin tended to be more person oriented, relationship orientated. You'll see below what that means with this particular model.
Yes.
Personal relationships essentially being more important than the laws and rules. So this is one of the classic things you see when that we all see when we're working overseas and around the world together, versus the laws and rules and relationships. No surprise there. Those of German origin were tending to emphasize that, with the Americans finding themselves very much in the middle there. Actually, there's a culture they found in that was often came in the middle, surprisingly enough, of a lot of these dichotomies. Was not the American culture, it was actually the Japanese culture. And and I'm wondering, you know, you start to theorize as to why certain cultures are good at adapting and trading around the world. And actually, I wonder whether being in the middle of some of these things is quite good, so you can see both ways. But here in this dichotomy, Americans in the middle, basically seeing both relationship-oriented and facts-oriented, both important.
Okay, so should we go to the next slide here?
Let's go there.
Power distance.
Power distance. This is the view of hierarchy.
Okay, so this is hierarchy. This is looking at how much space there is between you and the person at the top of the chart.
That's right.
Okay.
You know, and we do preach team oriented, don't we? We preach fairly flat.
Flat, yeah.
And no surprise that Belbin's very useful when there's flat structures and who's doing what and how does a team work together. But what you find here is the higher power distance. The Chinese origin were self-identifying. There with, again, Germans in the middle and Americans to the right-hand side with the lower power distance. Okay. Decentralized, flattened hierarchy.
And these were the same team, but just being asked
same group of individuals from the same company asked about these different questions in a workshop.
Let's get to the next one.
And this is what you find so interesting.
I love this slide.
So what do you notice here?
I love this because we've got the Americans there looking very much at the individualism, the I, where we have the Chinese there looking at the we.
Yes.
And I think this reflects quite well at the moment is the fact that Belbin in China is just flying, because it's never about I and standing up, you know, above everybody else. It's about how can we collectively achieve something. So this I thought was really interesting because this really does bear out the experiences that I've had as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And you know, the humbling thing in a sense in working in different countries is you realize actually the way you've learned about things, your own behaviors, your own values are challenged. Yes. So you're working in a collectivist culture. What does that really mean? Actually, does it challenge your individualism? Of course it does. Yes. So of course we all benefit from working with each other cross-culturally, whether it's virtual teams or in face-to-face, as we're able to do today, thank goodness, after a while. And you learn from each other. So you see the individualist side, it's what we also find is that correlates with a number of different things.
Yes. Okay.
So the individual feeling they also have to do a whole range of roles. Perform a range of roles, whereas the collectivist perhaps not so.
Not so. No, that could be interesting. So tell me on this. So this is a team that you worked with, and you've got them to answer questions on lots of different scales. Yeah. There wasn't just 3. I know there was. Did you find, therefore, that when you were working with this team, that you had a team of Americans all sitting together, a team of
Germans? We did start with. I mean, what was fascinating? I mean, it wasn't just the 3 cultures in the room either. This is just one of the particular sub-workshops.
Yes.
But I mean, one of the things that was very memorable from this particular company is you started the workshop actually with the people from China on one side and Europeans there with the Americans sort of mixing. So we were basically in our little cultural groups. And that was just very interesting. By the end of the workshop, after you've introduced this idea of team roles, and actually you have a lot in common with someone who's got the same team roles as you from a different culture, the mix started happening. And actually people ended up realizing, and this is the essence of Belbin's finding with culture, is you have a lot more in common with someone with the same team roles as you from another culture than actually you might do with people from your own culture with different team roles or a different orientation outlook in terms of team roles. So that's one of the things I first noticed from that workshop.
Let's just say that again, because I think that's really an important observation, is that people tended to be attracted and work with people who were like you.
We all culturally stereotype.
Yeah, we do.
So I think let's be honest about that. And then just so I had a cultural stereotype with this particular organization. I expected the German-Swiss people involved to be highly completer finisher oriented, for example. Like, you know, it was quite astounding. From the airport to the venue, it's basically I got a ticket from the airport to the venue, including the bus with the times on the ticket, and everything worked clockwork. So you expect that to, so I expect that you kind of expect that when you enter a workshop. But what I found is basically, you know, the resource investigators from China, and there were resource investigators, Swiss-German resource investigators, and they had a huge amount in common. And behaviourally, they seem very similar. They come across in a very similar way. And actually, that was one of the most visible times I've seen it, because it started with one country on one side, another country on another, and by the end, the mix was there and the dynamic interaction was happening.
Because I suppose, and that's what somebody was asking for. What is the stumbling block? Well, actually, it's the language, isn't it?
A common language.
A common language.
Yeah.
And you replacing the who I am and looking at nationality, looking at that culture, you actually then replace it by actually my strengths are resource investing. Oh, on that as well. And then people start talking in that way. That's right.
That's right. I mean, that's why people want. That's why that particular company wanted to use team roles, because the risk with you doing the studies of culture that we've just shown is that you then start to culturally stereotype.
Of course you do.
Okay,
yes.
You're collectivist, you're individualist.
And you don't want to do that.
And, you know, because you're from Italy, you're going to be like that and driving Ferraris and inventing lots of stuff. You're bound to be a plant. And then you're staggered to find that person from Italy is more withdrawn in terms of personality and perhaps more analytical. And actually so you need to move beyond, in a sense, the cultural stereotyping at some point, which is useful to know. As I said, particularly if you're setting up a company in a particular culture, or understanding the behaviors in a culture, or why do I need to build a relationship so strongly in that culture in order to get something done? So understanding all of that's very useful. But then when it comes to the team, the huge risk is if we start to stereotype based on so-and-so has got going to have certain behaviors because they're from that culture. And actually that just doesn't bear out at all.
No. And you're making massive assumptions there, which is to the detriment of the team, aren't you?
That's right.
So do we need to start with culture first, then use Belbin, or Belbin then culture, or both?
Well, we could talk about how I do it is I talk about culture in general.
Yes.
And then I start to introduce what people know, which is that people are different anyway. So how are they different? What impacts your behavior? Well, obviously culture does, but there's a number of other factors that impacts behavior. And actually, why is diversity important? So really, you're introducing team roles fairly early on, and you're working, as a lot of you do, with team roles to try and move people towards stuff that's very useful in the workplace. So yes, it is somewhat useful to know some of these cultural differences, particularly understanding people from a different culture. But even more useful is to use something like Belbin to say, okay, this is the behavior I might expect from you because you have particular team roles. Or these are the gaps in the team, and this is, you know, Joe and I sitting here realizing actually we're not going to stick to time. We're going to try, but we're probably not going to have the most practical outcomes. But as you're finding, it's hopefully an interesting discussion along the way. So we're doing all of this stuff around here. So that's the most important thing to remember, is that behaviours. We need that behavioural diversity in the team, and individuals' behaviours impact on the team.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I know one question we get asked a lot is how does the team roles distribution, how does that vary globally? You know, do we find that there's a high propensity of some team role behaviours in one country more than the other? And I think anecdotally we can come up with some examples, but we don't want to be anecdotal. We looked at the stats, and we showed that actually we looked at all of the databases from our distributors. We've got an amazing, it's because they're on here now, we've got an amazing I think about 30, 40, 50 distributors worldwide. So we took all of the data and we analysed it to work out whether or not, I don't know, there's higher shaper behaviour in America, there's higher team worker behaviour in Australia, for an example. And what we found after looking at, I think it's about 20,000 profiles, is what we found is that there was more difference within a country than between countries.
That's right. So actually there are variations between countries.
Yes.
But the biggest variations are within countries, particularly within people from different companies.
Absolutely.
So actually different company orientations. Yeah. So again, you need to look at the culture, but we need to then start to dig down fairly soon on into organizational culture. And obviously, as you'll find, you know, as we'll describe here, Belbin has a huge amount to say about obviously individual and team culture, but also about organizational culture. And you can describe those in terms of team roles. So you need to dig down, because that variation really, surprisingly enough, actually, it is a bit surprising. In terms of behaviours, team role behaviours, there's much more variation between individuals within countries than there is between individuals from different countries.
Absolutely. Sometimes I think that the whole culture thing sometimes is a bit of a red herring, actually. I think sometimes we use it, but actually, the more we delve in, the more we realise, is that the thing that we should be talking about, or is it more about behaviours? Is it more about people?
Yes.
And what's similar the way we do things?
And ultimately, a lot of us on here are consultants working with organisations, and in this webinar, and we want to help organisations improve their performance.
Yeah.
And how do you do that? You need tools that help you do that. Yes, as I was saying, it's useful to understand the culture so that you can help an organisation adapt to the host culture in which it's working, for example, or an individual coming into that culture to understand it. But even more important is how do you improve the performance of the team? And that's where you really need to start to look at team roles and individual behaviour and team behaviour.
I just want to share something with you though. So I'm just going to share my screen again for the umpteenth time, because I found this fascinating as when we were working in China. And these are their slides, so that's why the Chinese is on there as well, is that what we were looking at were differences. So we'd already looked at the study, we'd looked at the data, the big data, to show that there wasn't really that much difference. But we thought, well, hang on a minute, but we feel that there is some difference.
Yes.
So what we did is that we looked at, and I think we've got, can't find the stats here now, here we go, altogether about, oh crikey, thousands. I've got the figures here, but I haven't got my glasses on, of profiles. And what we wanted to look at. Do you
want me to look at that with my glasses?
No, that's fine. We wanted to look at the differences of types of profiles that we had for Belbin. And what with Belbin, we have the self-perception inventory, how you see yourself. And then you get feedback from other people. And that's the important bit, really. That's the bit of people validating whether or not you actually have those team role strengths. And what we have, and for you who are accredited, you know this very well, so 25% of you are very familiar with this, is that you can break down the profiles in terms of whether or not they're coherent. So that means everybody sees the same strengths as you do. Brilliant. You're compatible, which means there's some variation, but it's okay. You know, some people saying slightly different things to others, but overall, it's okay. We then have a divergent profile, and this is where the observers may agree with it, but they don't agree with you. And then we have a discordant profile, which is just massively sort of confused, really, where nobody sort of agrees with one another. And we were looking at these, comparing all of the US, well, not all of the USA, but the data that we had for the USA, the data we had for Europe, and then that for China. And we found that roughly the same percentage of profiles were coherent. So self, others agreeing with self. But what I found really interesting here is the amount of discordant profiles. And that really does shout out to me here that we had in China. And we asked, when we went over to China, we showed this data and we said, why do you think this is? Because we don't have the answers.
No.
We can just show the data. And the feedback was because they found that the culture was very much, if somebody says, can you do something, you say yes. So instead of saying, well, actually, I think so-and-so would be better suited to do that, or actually, I'm doing this. The idea is that you're expected to do everything. And therefore, people weren't sure where people's strengths were because they were never given the opportunity to really like showcase them. Would you say,
Well, I mean, what we're saying here is basically, are they finding it more difficult to declare a team role preference and to be clear about that? And I think that's the effectiveness of working with this, say in China, is actually, we know that people are more effective if they declare a preference and others know what to expect. So you're going to improve people's performance in China if you work with team roles using self and observer data and realizing actually that how this has how do I come across to others? Can I declare a team role preference? I think the other interesting bit of data, which is on that piece of paper, was you were saying that the people with a very strong top role preference, that was where the Europeans felt better able to declare a very strong team role preference. This is my team role, I'm not so good at the others, or these are my top two, I'm not so good at the others. And others agreed with that perhaps. And that does improve effectiveness. And it perhaps just is related to that cultural issue. Maybe a bit of the individualism perhaps in the States, saying I've got to be all things, perhaps. You know, if success is down to me, I've got to be all things. That's just, you know, these are just hypotheses. Or perhaps even in China, the collectivist, actually, maybe I just have to adapt to the needs of others, the relational side, and actually not declare my own preference. So there's a challenge there.
Isn't there just? But I think, you know, it's having that language to be able to talk about these things, isn't it? Is the important thing.
And what people find, quite frankly, is if you're using team roles, cross-cultural, it's a breath of fresh air to move away from you're like that because you're from that culture towards actually, I can expect this behavior from you because you're certain team roles. And it's a shared language, it's a shared understanding of human behavior that really applies across all cultures.
That's very true. I'm just going to share this other slide. We just chose one slide that I hadn't put up. This is the other thing we looked at, and this is, you can look at this data, I find it fascinating, is we also then looked at those observer words, and again we're looking at thousands here in this data set, and it's picking up the differences here. So although the distribution of team roles is very similar within each, I love the fact that the China one here, we've got the willingness to adapt, keen to impart expertise, which we don't have in the US and Europe in those top 10, but we do have in Europe and the US is conscious priorities, but that wasn't being reflected in the Chinese data. So again, it's interesting, and putting it to the audience, it's because they're so willing to learn. Whereas we've perhaps over, you know, in Europe, do we feel that we know what we're doing a bit more and prepared to delegate? I'm not sure. There's lots and lots of different hypotheses.
I think one of the things this also shows, we were discussing it earlier, this particular slide, is we were saying the variation of team roles between cultures isn't that high. Actually, you can see that in the words that are consistently appearing in the top across different cultures. But actually, within individual team roles, I think certain words are emphasised more in certain cultures. So, for example, you were talking about that adaptability side to the culture in China, which is coming out from the willing to adapt.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. So that's a bit of a look. We said we talk about culture, and there's overlaps between country and looking at country culture and also organisational culture. So for the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes, Tom.
Is that what we've got?
I know, that's all we've got left. I told you time would fly. Do we want to just briefly look at organisational culture?
Let's go in there.
Shall we do that?
I think we need to whiz into some slides.
Do you want some slides? Are we going to do that for speed?
You know, typically we're presenting with slides because we're trainers. I know it's a webinar, but what I really like, if you're into if you want to know a person who's really good on organisational culture, obviously there's Meredith Belbin,
obviously
Coming Shape of Organisations, etc. But this guy Edgar Schein is marvellous on culture, and I think he really provides an understanding. And he says that the only real important thing that leaders need to do is create and manage culture. The problem that we were just saying is actually to define culture is quite difficult.
Isn't it?
To change culture is quite difficult.
Yes.
So that's where Belbin's such a useful tool, because it's about behaviours. I use Belbin through Belbin, obviously, but I use it with my individual culture clients, because it keeps coming back to that issue of behaviour and interaction diversity. So if we go on to the next slide, you'll see that this is Shine's idea of a lily pond. So you've heard of the very, this is the way we do things around here as a culture. But in a sense, that's just what you see on the post-its on the wall, or
your inspirational cat posters, the websites.
It's not the depth. Yeah. And what I really like behind this idea is that you've got the surface level, which is basically the leaves and the flowers. That's how we do things around here. Underneath that, the explanation of why we do things sits underneath. And I really like this idea that you've got the history and the background that people have already mentioned.
Yeah,
I heard that in one of the chats.
Yes.
And who planted what, and from a superficial level to a real understanding, you need to understand some of that history, that context, that background. And actually, we need to understand that in a way that we can start to make a difference. So what Shine does is, okay, we understand this, we understand these concepts. What he recommends people do is not we don't run a culture workshop and just work on culture. Actually decide what you need to change, and then set about changing it one step at a time, or one project at a time, in the right way. So for example, if you're very individualist as a culture, and perhaps that means in your organization you're not particularly team oriented, well, how do you pay people? Do you pay people as individuals, or do you pay them as a team? And actually, there's an element to which you get a team performance reward. You're going to start to change things. So people jump to often to cash in organizations. What am I paid to do? Or performance measures. Are you measured for performance as a team? So if you're going to start to shift things, that's how you start to do it.
Okay.
And Shine emphasizes those, one step at a time. Because when you say, okay, let's look at a culture and changing a culture, how do you do that? It's huge. But actually, if you think, actually, we can take the bite size of the elephant.
Yes,
and we can
absolutely.
do that. Yeah.
How do you eat an elephant?
How do you eat an elephant?
One bite at a time. So this is interesting. We had some questions actually before the webinar. Tom said, do we find groupings of team roles? So not you, Tom, another Tom. Do we find groupings of team role behaviours within certain types of organisation?
Definitely. So we were talking about the NHS earlier, because we both worked a lot with the NHS. You'll find certain groupings that vary quite a lot between, say, sort of, in the UK, we call them public sector, but say our health service, the National Health Service, hospital setting, quite different set of cultural behaviours, quite different team role overview. As we'll show you, can actually produce team role profiles of organisations. Yes. Very different to, say, more of a startup entrepreneurial organisation or a large conglomerate. Yeah. So you start to see quite big differences.
No, you do. And actually, we'll be really crunching that data soon as well, because we're going to be launching the latest version of Belbin very soon. And, that's when we start really looking at the depth and the stats to be able to see that. But I think, you go into some organisations and you can just sense that there is a preponderance of certain team roles, and that really is influencing the culture. Can we use this next slide?
Yeah, do use it, because it brings Belbin in. Actually. We like to bring Belbin in. So here we are. So how would you describe a culture? You're going to see one organisation, it's in a sense a profile. But just to start with, say the organisation you're about to see would emphasise maybe the team worker, perhaps the teamwork and coordinator. The focus there, if you go to the next column, will be on HR, particularly human relations model. And you go down the rest, actually just to contrast it with an organisation that maybe has a slant towards more of a shaper, perhaps monitor, evaluator culture focus. And there's very much the focus, if you go down one more, it's going to be on output and competitiveness, rational goals. Okay, emphasize stretch targets. Jo, have you ever set those?
No, anyone? No, we don't have
those. Whereas,
sitting
over here in the coordinator, let's just actually try and set a bit more of a people-oriented set of targets there. And actually, there's a positive sides to those.
Of course.
And actually, what you've got to be aware of is the flip side. So the flip side can be, and all of you have seen these slides who have been accredited, because we have them on the accreditation pack. But what we talk about with the flip side of there is actually the organisation I might well set up culture leaders often lead a culture, don't we?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I may well set up. The risk would be unproductive discussion, a bit more of a country club style.
Yeah.
Actually, however, Jo, I would just say, I'm not saying hostility is going to come. You know, the RI, well, you get on with lots of
I get
people.
on with people.
But there's a risk there. It becomes a bit of a sweatshop. Okay, so we've just got to be aware of that. It's not to put ourselves down as a culture, but just to say, okay, what is our tendency? And then what do we do about it? So if we move on to our last two slides.
Can I just say that right now, I should imagine there's quite a few people who are joining us for the webinar, reading that and going,
yes,
that's where I am right now. Or
yeah.
I've been working with a company very much like that. I should imagine there's quite a few light bulb moments going on. You're thinking back and thinking, actually, I now understand why.
Okay, if you work in the public sector, if you work in the civil service, you'll recognise the frozen bureaucracy element. I come across that quite a lot, where people really, actually, this just seems so bureaucratic, it's not going anywhere. And I'll say, well, careful what you wish for. Do you want tumultuous anarchy? So basically, if you've got an entrepreneurial, the plants and resource investigators with a bit of the shaper in there, you know, they often set up an organisation. But they find it quite difficult to survive in the organisation they set up themselves. Because obviously you then bring in other people to run the organisation, and you end up with more of the implementer, completer, finisher, because they're recruiting to difference. And it's actually, it's a bit, I'm feeling a bit constrained here. I want a bit more anarchy.
Yes.
But then those liking the constraints of, you know, the boundaries in the sense of that implementer role particular, you know, I like to know where I stand. They find it quite difficult with the anarchy.
I think sometimes that's why the people like the Richard Bransons of the world have got so many different hats and so many different organisations, because they go, well, this works now. Off they go and start something else. You had a wonderful experience, didn't you, using culture within
the organisational culture. I think that why this springs to mind is I actually, as I did before I came in here, I got Meredith to say what he thought. So they had their report. We worked as a team, and then he basically gave a visual to them.
Can I just say at this point, Tom was quite sneaky, because he'd been doing this other work, and he managed to catch Meredith. If I remember right, he was doing his gardening.
He was doing his gardening,
and we just knock on the door. Meredith, can I just get a little bit of feedback here?
A bit of feedback. Actually, I didn't know what to say. That's the honest truth is, you know, when you look at team roles at the whole, as you're about to, can you put it up?
Yeah, sorry.
You know, it's okay. The so what is always the question. What do you do around here? What are you going to do? So teamwork is specialist culture. But basically what that actually means, you know, strong people orientation, like to know what they're talking about, with the resource investigator there, some outward looking nature, the risk there, bottom role shaper, you'll all, if you've used team roles before, what does that mean? Risk of lack of drive.
Getting stuff done.
Well, it's that pushing through, isn't it?
Yes.
And I thought, okay, well, that's great, because we got the descriptions on the next page, which you'll sort of recognise.
Do you want me to go to next?
But let's
No.
The top words were helpful, conscious of priorities, and caring, and so forth. I mean, the thing is, you know, we'll show you the next page, but because it's the last slide, but then we'll come back to it. Can we do that?
Yeah, we can.
So this is what it says in the Belbin report. So it's the stuff we know about, but it doesn't quite capture culture of an organization. And that's what we're trying to do in the next version of the Belbin system is, okay, how do we capture organizational culture in our reports? So this looked good, you know, so there's an element of higher people-oriented professionals, all this stuff originally, by the way, written by Meredith Belbin.
Absolutely.
It's why it's so good. And we've updated it over the years, but, you know, he's really good at the synthesis stuff. So, and he would say you need to find that dominant person to project your image. So that's one of the things we'd always say to do. Okay, that bottom role is shaper. In that, if you go back to the previous one, thanks, Jo. So go back to that bottom role of shaper. Okay, it's not that you need to start recruiting loads of shapers overnight, but what you need, they're probably in that organization going to be a number of shapers. How do you allow them to have voice? Are they suppressed within that culture? Are they allowed to drive, and are they given freedom to push and drive things forward? So that's one question you might ask, and how do you do that? So that's the sort of the how-tos. But what I really liked when Meredith, you know, he gives a pithy summary. He says, you know, the risk here is a desert island culture.
See, I love that, a desert island culture.
So, you know, we're we're a great team worker,
Yeah.
specialist. We know what we're talking about. We
Mhm.
developed based on our expertise. We do a lot of talking to each other. There is some external communication, but there's a risk that we don't see the sharks coming, the competitors. Okay, and that was
Yes.
actually, for this organization, the major risk. And until he'd said that, I hadn't really articulated what I'd felt. So that thing about, to right back to what we said at the beginning,
Yeah.
Meredith said, actually, you can feel a culture. The intuition you pick up when you're in an organization. I'd got this sense of this, but he hadn't quite, he articulated it very well. There are a number of competitors, you're doing very well at the moment. But are we ready? Are we ready to compete when there are a number of other people joining the marketplace? And that was a great challenge to them. It got them looking at basically how to get ready for those competitors.
It's useful having Meredith living quite close, isn't
Yes,
it?
indeed.
Sometimes you get those wonderful points,
nuggets,
isn't there? Yeah, nuggets of for the wisdom that he brings. My goodness, time goes quickly. I think what we've really looked at today is the fact that culture, and talking about culture, it's such a large, vast subject. Are we talking about culture when it comes to country? Are we talking about culture when it comes to organisational culture? Belbin can be used in both areas very much, and what we will be doing is a lot of the stats that we've been talking about, they will be sent to you on the email that you'll get tomorrow with the recording as well. So all of those stats and figures and these slides will be sent to you, because I think it's time to just take a look at things, and you need to work out what is it that you're actually looking at. Are you looking at organisational culture? Are you looking at country culture? Are you looking at a mishmash of the two? Like you said before, you could have the culture where you're from, where the organisation is, the other people that you're working with, the organisational culture. It's defining the C, isn't it? It's
Indeed.
trying to find that C right at the very beginning. We talked about the boat with the behaviour. The culture is very much what's underneath, and like the lily pads as well, what's underneath, trying to find out a little bit more. And what Belbin can do is give you a language to help put all of other things to one side and give people a common language to be able to talk about their behaviour and what they actually do, how they can work together. And this is what it's all about, isn't it? How to be more effective, how to have more effective relationships, and for the teams to be more effective, regardless of everything else, because actually using that common language really, really is key. I'm just going to now go to some questions here, Tom. We've got a few minutes. Okay. Have you found, hang on, answer live. Have you found that culture affects people's values? That's an interesting question.
Well, cultural values, we talk about cultural values. So yes, and I think that culture does impact on your values. So there's another slide that we use, what underpins behaviour, and you've got values in there, values and motivation. And what underpins those values is definitely culture. I mean, we haven't touched on it, the issue of gender or particularly of ethnicity.
Yes, no, true.
But what I do find, for example, is there's certain cultures in which women are not expected to play a more dominant role. And so therefore it does affect the way they their self-perception of their own team roles. So does it affect people's values? Well, it certainly affects the values that they have in the culture, certainly affects how they feel they can contribute. And what we found in that setting is that team roles is a very good way of giving voice to women, particularly in the culture I'm thinking of, giving voice to those team roles. It's we actually need your contribution. Because they might self-perception wise say they don't have that role. But others might say, actually, you're quite strong in the more dominant role, say shaper or coordinator. Could you contribute that? We really need it.
Thank you. Actually, it just reminded me, we've got a great case study that Phil Merry contributed, talking about just that.
Yes.
And it was Belbin that gave this woman her voice, enabled her to be able to make the contribution she knew she could make, but actually was unable to do so.
Yes, and that might apply to ethnic backgrounds, skin color, whatever the difference you're finding is how do you have a good voice in the team? How do you express your team roles in the organisation?
No, good question. Thank you, Bob. Answer this one. Since we said that culture is best effective when it comes from the top, how can we ensure that our leaders This is an interesting one. Looking at the longer term rather than the short term. How can...
Well, I've given a talk at Belbin about counterinsurgency, because lots of things come from the top. But if you're in a large organisation, you're often not working at the top. You might. So what Belbin does is provide a sort of way of shaking things up in the middle. And hopefully some of those people might find themselves in positions of influence, but you'll certainly be impacting on the team. So I'd say, you influence from the middle, and actually if they start to see performance improving, which is what the short-term profits might even be about, because you need to produce some profit, you need performance. If they see it producing performance, where did that come from? And before you know it, you've got this diversity tool that they're using with an exec team, looking at with team roles that actually is slightly countercultural, but making an impact.
I think that's quite a common conversation we've had with people actually. So, well, how did you get, Belbin introduced? Well, actually, we didn't go to the top.
No.
We got people using it and actually let the results speak for themselves. And
obviously, it's great when people who are setting up the culture, the founders or the leaders who have most say over the way a culture is, take hold of it. And we do have quite a lot of that. But what I'm saying is, don't give up if you're in an organisation where you feel a bit countercultural. Just as Shine says, a bit step at a time. Use a tool, use something that moves you forward in the direction you want to go in.
Thank you very much, Tom. Do you think Zoom's changed our culture over the last year or so?
Well, virtual teams have been around for a long time.
They have, yes.
But yes, it does obviously have an impact. What we do find is that certain team roles really like Zoom and certain others don't like
some
it.
Don't, yes.
And some people like remote working, home working.
Some people don't.
And some people can't stand it. So I'm back to happy because I can interact. I'm happy with the screen there, but I can't see you. And when you're 1 inch wide, that's a UK measure, when you're a couple of centimetres wide, then it's not really the same as when we can interact face to face, but at least we have this tool. It's been amazing to be able to use this.
Hasn't it just? We've got a little bit of research on that I would share with you, but there's nothing major there. I think what we need to remember is that Zoom has actually, again, when we talk about values, motivations, things that change our behaviour. This last year has changed people's behaviour, and to expect people to flip back when they are going back into the office, it's quite unrealistic, because all of this is informing the way that we behave. It's informing the culture of our teams as well. So to take that on board now when you're taking that next step, isn't it?
Indeed.
Perfect, thank you. Right. We have overrun slightly by 4 minutes, and I'm absolutely ashamed by that. I'm so sorry. What a shock horror. We knew that was coming. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody. I think I'm going to invite Tom back and get him to talk in more detail about some of the case studies, if that's okay, that you've done, because I think there's some more meat that we can get there. Like we said, we've only really been able to scratch the surface of such a vast subject.
Maybe we get 1 or 2 of the people on the chat
in there. I think we should.
I see, for example,
involved.
Malcolm, I recognise you from one of the early days UN trainings, where I first came across with Meredith at Malcolm's setting in Turin. So I'm sure he's got a lot to say on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we work, and I know a lot of our distributors as well, we work with the UN, worldwide. It's I bet you've got some stories.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Also looking at, as Linda Keller was saying, look at the use of direct and indirect language. There's so much that we can look at here, isn't there? Brilliant. I'm now going to do what I normally do, is I'm going to copy and paste the chat, because what happens is some great stuff in there.
And we all lose it.
And we all lose it, but we're not going to, because we're going to make sure that we have it.
Good.
We will answer any questions that we haven't been able to, and many, many apologies. And we will be sending everything out tomorrow. And if you've got any questions at all that you want to ask, please just reply to that email, and I will put Tom's contact details on as well. Is that okay, Tom?
Yeah,
I just said that. Are you sure that's all right? I'll put his LinkedIn details on there, so you can get in contact if you would like to continue the conversation. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll be sending an email out hopefully at the end of this week, maybe beginning of next, with some more webinars, and also what we've been working at recently at the Belbin office, so please keep an eye out for that. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, and thank you, Vicky. Actually, I've just noticed Vicky's been contributing massively to the chat, so thank you very much.
Vicky is what you call a background guru.
Oh my goodness, and she is a guru.
She's a guru.
Oh
so
my goodness.
who wrote this paper
Who wrote this
on
paper?
Belbin
Vicky.
and culture? It wasn't me, it was
Yeah.
Vicky.
She knows what she's talking about.
She does.
And that's what we will be sending to you as well as
Yeah.
a click in that email. So please do so. So thank you very, very, very much indeed. Copy and paste. I have to do. So do you know a song you'd like to sing for everybody whilst we do this?
No, let's not do that.
Let's not do that. Okay,
No.
we won't do that.
No, you don't want to hear that. I'm not sure that even fits into the team role wheel.
I don't think it does.
How awful that will be.
Absolutely. It does sometimes
Now
say...
you say that sometimes we finish these and carry on. Is that the idea?
Well, if anybody's got any questions, of course we can carry on. If there's anything else that you thought that we should have talked about, which we haven't talked about, John?
I don't know. You look at the questions.
Okay, I will do, but I'm multitasking. And I know obviously I'm
Quite
very
brilliant.
good at that. But let's just do one thing at a time here because I don't want to lose this chat. Oh dear. Right, here we go. Copy, paste, sorted. Right, back to the webinar. Okay. Yes, so Trevor actually is on here. He does work with lots of multicultural teams. So I'm sure Trevor would be delighted to hear your input at some point. And of course, we will send you that paper. Other questions that are coming up. Right, somebody did want to know about Belbin in Africa. Now, you've took your whole family down.
Obviously,
to
South Africa was one of the original places in
Yep.
which team roles were developed with Darry Giles down there. Many years ago, but obviously I've worked in international development from time to time. And that has brought me to Africa, where I've used team roles. It wasn't why I went there.
No.
It just when you're working with a team, it comes up, and it was equally applicable in that context. And actually, they were even using it in certain contexts with at the completely other end, you'd say, of the scale with street kids. And someone was using it with the Get Set back in the day, which is the Belbin young person's version. And they were using it basically as, okay, I'm not nothing. What do I have in terms of skills? Because often people say, well, what do you have? I don't have anything. So there's a lack of confidence there. And actually others saying what you might contribute. You know, you're resourceful, you're energetic, you're dynamic.
Oh my goodness.
And actually, they used it to good effect with street kids. So you can basically use it in most contexts. I would yet to find a context in which it's not useful. It might be countercultural, but that doesn't mean it's not useful.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. I think one thing we did mention, Tom, is that how much is in so much experience, and we need to just chat, don't we, over perhaps a coffee or a glass of wine, and actually be able to capture all of this massive experience that you've got, that, you know, really... Well,
not just me, but loads of people in the chat and in the team.
Absolutely.
Actually, when you work with when we work with a tool for a number of years, as a number of us have, you end up picking stuff that picking up stuff that you don't really realise until you ask questions.
Absolutely.
And so actually, I've got an insight into that.
Yeah, we've got so much here.
Yeah.
But thank you very much indeed, everybody, and we will see you again soon. Take care. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye.